Okay guys, so we're moving on to the remaining definitions. We'll be looking at what goods are. In line with that, who is not a consumer. Who is not a consumer is basically everyone who is, it's the exact opposite of who is a consumer. Okay, and what are consumer rights? So first let's move on to goods. Goods are actually, we have two types of goods. Okay, we have uh, movable goods and we have immovable goods. Now mostly with regards to goods, when we refer to goods, we are only talking about the movable type. Okay, so let's look at the definition. In a law known as the Sale of Goods Act of 1930, this law you all would have studied it in jurisprudence if you all are module 1 students. This law mainly defines goods to be something which is movable property. Okay, generally goods, like I said, we will consider it as movable property, otherwise we will call it as immovable property or land. So movable property, but does not include actionable claims and money. So what does it not include? Something known as actionable claims. Actionable claims are basically anything other than like anything other than a mortgage or anything other than a pledge or hypothecation. So any other form is known as actionable claim. So it's like if you are renting out a PG and you are paying a rent of say 5,000 rupees monthly for staying in that PG. Now you don't end up paying that 5,000 rupees for 2 months. Now, have you mortgaged anything to the tenant? No, that doesn't even apply here. Have you pledged anything? Like, have you given any of your movable goods to the tenant and said, okay, here, keep this as my security deposit or something? No, it's not the case. So, anything other than that category is known as actionable claims. So, you've not paid the rent, the tenant can go and take you to court and say that he owes me 10,000 rupees plus whatever, so and so. So it does not include actionable claims. Goods does not include money. Okay, but what does it include? They're saying it includes stock and shares. Okay, shares, you all know, shares of a company are equivalent to movable goods. So movable property, shares, and then they're saying growing crops, grass, things attached to earth, or things attached or attached to the earth forming part of that land. Which is agreed to be severed either by contract or contract of sale, before sale or before a contract of sale. So let me just change that line over here. For a okay, I'll repeat this definition for you. Movable goods includes, goods includes any kind of movable property other than actionable claims and money. What does it include? Stocks. Why do they talk about growing crops, grass, things attached to the earth, or things attached to that which is forming part of the land, agreed to be severed before sale of contract? Contract of sale. It's because, simple definition, differentiate between what is movable and what is immovable property. Okay, what is movable property? You can move it from one end to the other end. You can carry it around and walk with you. Okay, immovable property is what? It cannot be moved. This is a clear distinction between movable and immovable property. But now they realize that there's one small issue with this definition of immovable property. What they realized was, okay, immovable property includes land. Okay, now on this land, let's say grass will be growing. You're going to use it for agriculture. You're going to be growing things from that land, correct? Trees will be growing on it. Avocado trees, apple trees, pear trees, okay? All of these things will be growing on the land. Now, does grass form part of immovable property? The answer is yes, because it is attached to the land. Without the land, the grass is not going to grow. The tree is not going to grow. But what if we end up cutting the grass? Okay, when we end up cutting the grass, or when we end up cutting the tree and using that tree for the purpose of timber or making furniture, whatever it is, then it becomes movable property. Now, the same thing applies to any kind of crops. If they are going to be growing tea or coffee on the land, and what do they do with that tea or coffee product? They grow it as a plant on the immovable property, then they cut it off and then they sell it as a separate goods. So now, does this tea or coffee become movable or immovable property? Till the time it was growing on the immovable property, it is immovable. But the minute it is severed or it is cut, why will you cut a coffee plant, or why will you cut a tea plant? It's simple, because you're going to sell it to someone. You're either going to sell it, or someone's entered into a contract with you saying, okay, I'll pay you so much money if you produce so much tea and give it to me. So now read the definition again. It does not include actionable claims in money, but it includes stock and shares. Growing crops, grass, things attached to the earth, or forming part of the land, which is agreed to be severed before the sale or under a contract of sale. This is what amounts to goods, and very important definition. Now, in this case of Morgan Stanley Mutual Fund versus Karthik Das, what happened was they were like, okay, fine, stocks and shares are goods, correct? But what this particular person had done was, he had not yet received the stocks or the shares of the company. How do you actually acquire stocks of the company? First, you have to make an application to the company. The company accepts your application, and then only they will provide you the shares in the company. Now, at this stage, what this person has done is, he's made an application to the company, but it's not yet been allotted to him. So, mere application for shares in a company cannot amount to goods, because it does not even exist as yet. It has not even been given to you as yet, and therefore that was what was held in this case. At the stage of application, there is no purchase of goods for any kind of consideration, and therefore he cannot be called the purchaser of those particular shares. So that this has come in the case of Morgan Stanley versus Karthik Das. Now, we'll come into who is not a consumer. This is very, very simple. Again, remember, consumer is any person who buys the goods for a certain consideration. Now, this also applies to services. It does not include any person who is merely buying it for resale or using it for commercial purpose. We are not talking about those people who are living their livelihood by means of self-employment. So, who and all is not a consumer? Anyone who obtains goods for free of charge. You get free samples, you're not a consumer. Free services, not consumer. Obtains for resale or commercial purpose, not consumer. Who avails services for commercial purposes, and who avails services under a contract for service. So this I will explain to you a little later on, but these are the people who are not consumers. What are consumer rights? Very, 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 very important. I cannot stress on it. That's how important it is. It may seem very, very simple, and hence you will forget it. Please remember, those things which are the most simplest are the easiest to forget. It makes the most amount of common sense, but read it at least 2-3 times. What are the consumer rights? Simple. To be protected against false marketing of goods and services. To be protected against false marketing of goods and services which are hazardous to your life and property. That you wish to be informed of quality, quantity, potency, purity, standards and price of goods. So QQ, 2 Q's, 3 P's, 1 S. Okay, you remember it this way: quality, quantity, 2 Q's. Potency, purity, price, 3 P's. 1S standards of what? Of all your goods and services, and you need to be protected against unfair trade practices. Then also remember, I said you have to be given a choice, that consumers should be given a variety of goods and services at competitive prices. You're not simply giving the choice to the consumer because he's a consumer. No. Why do we give a choice to the consumer? When there are multiple products, they will compete with each other for quality, quantity, price, potency, purity, all of them. Okay. So 3. 4. The right to be heard in case of any kind of dispute before a consumer forum. So with regards to the right to be heard, we will be studying about consumer forums a little later on, probably in the next video. The right to seek redressal against any unfair trade practices, restrictive trade practices, or any form of exploitation of consumers. So protection against RTP, that is restrictive trade practices, plus unfair trade practices. Okay, and the right to consumer awareness. These are your consumer rights. Protection mainly, to be given a choice, to be informed, the right to be heard, redressal, and awareness. Now we're coming to the two more definitions, that is defect and deficiency. This I won't go into too much detail. A defect is basically any kind of fault, imperfection, or shortcoming in the quality, quantity, potency, purity standards which the product is supposed to have. So that is what we call as a defective product. What do you mean by deficiency? Now defect and deficiency are used very commonly as the exact same word. If we'll generally say this product is defected, or we'll say that this product has a deficiency in it. It may seem similar, but they have two different definitions. Defect, shortcoming. Deficiency is also a shortcoming, a fault, imperfection, or shortcoming in the quality, nature, and the manner of the performance of services. By doing what? By any act of negligence or omission which causes loss to consumer, and deliberately withholding relevant information to the consumer. So this is a very interesting part about deficiency in services, because even withholding information from the consumer amounts to a deficiency. Okay, we look at the case laws. I won't go, I will not hold the first case law as very important. That is the SGS India versus Dolphin International. This is largely an evidence-based case law, and therefore I'm saying that it's not very important. We'll come to the next one, that is Dr. Harish Kumar Khurana versus Joginder Singh. Okay, this case law has entirely to do with medical negligence. Okay. Medical negligence is one of the most grey areas in law and consumer protection as we know it, because have you noticed that you may have undergone this particular surgery, or someone you know may have undergone certain kind of medical treatment, and normally when it is to do with maybe smaller ailments, we do not recognize it as much. Like let's say I have a rash and the doctor tells me that the medicine has a 95% efficacy rate. That means 95% of the people have found it to be very efficient. So it's great. But sadly, I tend to fall under the 5%, just for example's sake. And so this medicine does not work for me. So do I go and file a case against the doctor? Do I go and file a case against the doctor saying this particular product didn't work for me? So holding medical professionals negligent is not exactly the most obvious way to go about things. Okay? However, this changes because what if a surgery was done and a patient dies? There a lot more emotion is there. I mean, compared to the rash in the hand and the death of a person, I will call the death of a person much more serious. And especially if we assume that a surgery did not happen properly, then we tend to go and file cases against the hospital itself or against a medical professional. Now this medical professional has done a surgery which may work on the person or may not work on the person. Okay? It's not like the better the surgeon you are, the more efficient the surgery is. No, there is the same surgery can work for the 100% success rate for one person, and it can work at a 5% success rate for another person. This has come up with regards to medical negligence. And what will tend to happen if the patient dies, the family members in that emotional state, in the state of mind that they are, will go and file negligence cases against the hospital. And that's why they said that you cannot hold a medical professional negligent for a treatment that has only so and so efficiency rate. Okay, but if the medical professional was negligent, or due to some negligence or some activity that he had done, that he had caused more harm to the patient, then you can go to the court and get some kind of a remedy. And that is the case with regards to medical negligence, as was held in the case of Harish Kumar Khurana versus Joginder Singh. Okay. Next is your definition of restrictive trade practices. Restrictive trade practices is basically any kind of a trade practice which restricts the flow of goods or services, whether it is providing those services or providing those goods, or availing those services and goods in the market. So, how do you end up restricting? You end up restricting mainly by imposing unjustified costs and restrictions on the consumers. Okay, so let's read this definition. Restrictive trade practice is any kind of trade practice which brings about a manipulation of price or the conditions of delivery. So, first one is manipulation in price, second one is condition of delivery, and you're affecting how these goods are available in the market. Most common form of restrictive trade practices we've seen is with regards to vegetables. Okay. Sometimes they'll be like, due to heavy rains, the price of lemons had gone up exorbitantly. It was earlier, if you were buying say 10 lemons for 30 or 40 rupees, now you are buying one lemon for 10 rupees. So if I had to buy 10, I had to pay 100 rupees, which is a 60 rupee increase in price. Now, why does this happen? Because there is an excessive demand in the market and a very low supply. This is where restrictive trade practices tend to come about. Yeah, maybe the rains came and destroyed the crop and there's a very low supply of lemons in the market. But do I have to pay 10 rupees for it? No, I could have probably paid say 5 rupees to compensate the traders. So this is where mostly restrictive trade practices come in. Mainly it's to do with manipulation of price, and someone is controlling the flow of supplies into and outside of the market. And they're saying that it includes, so this restrictive trade practices include delay beyond the period agreed by the trader to supply goods or services, and that has likely to lead in likely to rise in price. So if there is companies work on timelines, everything is on timelines. So if I've entered into a contract with you to provide say 10 kgs of cocoa powder to you, then I should provide that 10 kgs of cocoa powder to you. Let's say this contract was entered into between A and B in the month of January. What am I saying? January once. Let's say they were in the month of October. Okay, so in the month of October, I've entered into a contract with A saying that, listen, I want 10 tons of cocoa powder. Now, what A does is, I mean, why do I want it in October? Because by November, I'll finish production of my chocolates. Okay, and by December, I will be able to handle the increased demand for chocolates, maybe say during Christmas or the holiday times and New Year's and etc. So this is my production plan as a company. What should A have done? A should have given me my cocoa powder in October and November, because I may have needed it then. Now, what has happened as a result of him not giving me my cocoa powder? I would have had to go and approach some person C. Okay? A would have been giving me at 10 rupees. But because now sudden change in plans, C is also very smart. He's like, oh, they need it immediately, I'll charge them 13 rupees for the cocoa powder. Okay, and that's a lot, especially for companies dealing with such high quantities. 1 rupee also matters a lot. So the delay for providing goods or services which is likely to increase in price also actually amounts to restrictive trade practices. Who knows? A and C might have entered into some contract with each other. We don't know. Okay, so I'm not going into that. Second one is any trade practice which requires a consumer to buy any goods or services or avail services as a condition precedent for buying or hiring other services. Okay. Best example for this was the case of filling petrol. Okay, so whoever has two-wheelers, you have to go and fill petrol into your vehicles, right? Now, what was happening at the petrol bunk was they said that if you wish to fill, sorry, what am I saying? Filling petrol, my bad. Right. If you wish to buy, let's say in the petrol bunk itself, there's this little shop which sells a lot of chocolates and something like that. And to buy a chocolate, okay, I had to first fill petrol. Where is the correlation between the two? Just because you're selling chocolates in a petrol bunk is not my problem. Okay, I came to fill petrol, that's the only thing I'll be buying. But if you force me to buy a chocolate because I wish to fill petrol, that is a condition attached. Okay, similarly, you would have seen this. Okay, you wanted to buy, say, shampoo, but you know how they pack up these shampoo bottles nicely with another product behind it, and attached to the shampoo will be some kind of a powder. Okay, this powder, I don't want the powder, I only want to buy the shampoo. But they're saying that combo, I mean, if I want to pick up the shampoo, I have to buy the powder also. The shampoo costs only around, say, like 57 rupees. But with the addition of the powder, I have to pay another 52 rupees and my total comes up to 109. Why should I pay 109 rupees to buy a shampoo and a powder that I did not want? This is what we call as condition attached, or condition precedent to buying any other product. This amounts purely to a restrictive trade practice. Okay guys, the next one we have with regards to service. Service is very, very simple. It means a service of any description. It can be related to banking, finance, electricity, house construction, entertainment, amusement, providing other professional services. It can mean anything. Okay, so service is a very, very wide term. And one thing under service which I want all of you all to understand is they're very clear about one thing. It does not include the rendering of any service free of charge. Okay? This applied even to goods. Getting any kind of goods free of charge does not amount to you being a consumer. So getting service free of charge does not mean service as per this law. And under a contract of personal service. So what is this contract of personal service? Okay, that is why they've discussed this in the case of Indian Merchants Association versus VP Shanta. Okay, wherein here they made a differentiation between two kinds of terms. That is, if you can see, a contract of service and a contract for service. The difference is in the word of and for. Now, what's happening over here is that before I go into this particular explanation, I will present the situation to you. Now, let's take the first situation, that is in the case of an employee. Who is an employee? An employee is a person who approaches an employer and tells him, see, these are my skills, these are the benefits I can bring to you, hire me, I will do this work for you, you pay me my salary. Okay. Now, what happens in an employment? As an employee, are you really there for, yeah, you have skills that your employer wants. but your employer doesn't want anything more than that. Okay, so you are restricted to following his or her instructions. You will follow those instructions exactly the way the employer wants it. Okay, you will probably not do any work in excess of what is required. Okay, and all instructions will come from your employer only. If you try doing it any other way, you will probably get fired from your job, or any such other thing. So when you are under the directions of another person, then that is a certain type of employment. But now I'm coming to the second situation. The second situation is where, let's say I wish to build a house. Okay, now when I wish to build a house, I don't have the expertise to design a house, build it, because I have no idea how construction works. And there's also a well-known thing that, okay, fine, if I take a professional's help, my cost will probably get reduced and I may get some benefits of their good designs or something like that. So what I decide to do is, okay, fine, I enter into an agreement with an architect, or an architect and an engineer, and I tell them, see, I will provide you with the money, you build my house for me. Okay, the architect comes with his or her own experience, the civil engineer will come with his or her own experience, and they will decide how the house is being built. Obviously they'll keep me in mind because it's my house, I'll want it in a certain way, they will keep that in mind, but then they are using their own skill and expertise to start working on, to start building the house. Now do I go and tell them, see, now you have to lay the floor, now you have to do this, now you have to paint the walls? I don't do any of those things. I provide the money when they ask for it, I ask some extra details, I provide the things that I require my house to look like. So what is the architect and the civil engineer doing? They are working for me. Okay, but are they